Overnight, Russia launched over 700 air attacks against Ukraine, the largest by far of the war. And this is coming on the heels of two previous records that Russia has launched against Ukraine, a combination of drones, missiles, cruise missiles, etc., all of which are causing significant damage, continue to cause damage inside of Ukraine. Also continues to raise the specter of why they say they have such urgent need for air defense interceptor missiles and other air defense capacities. Now, the question is going to be, is this too little too late that the West is offering? Will it make a difference? And in fact, is there any point in even continuing the war on? All of these questions need to be answered, and all of them are up front, and especially what the United States is going to do in terms of its rather chaotic policies that have been going kind of back and forth here over the last several months. And to try and make sense of a lot of this, we have another one of our favorites here, Patrick Henningsen, host of the Sunday Wire. Patrick Henningsen at Substack.com. We'll talk more about that at the end. But Patrick, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be with you, Danny.
Well, it is, Amanda. We have a lot to talk about here. So there was some pretty dramatic escalation last night in terms of the capacity of Russia, because I guess it was last week or a few days ago, within 3 days, Russia launched, I think, 500 air attacks in one day, and then 550, I think, 2 days later. So 1,000 within a span of about 48 hours. And then now that here, this one is 700, I think 728, 731, depending on who you want to look at. And in fact, when you look at the track of the drones, I actually can't find the source material on this. I've seen it many times, but this shows where the drones and missiles were launched from. They actually we're able to track in open source. It's really quite amazing, the capability that private citizens can provide and then put on the internet today. But we see there, and by the way, if people can see in there, you see there's yellow lines, there's some red lines and some blue lines. The yellow lines are all drones, which is the vast majority of the attack, and most of those are Shahed 2, Garin 2s, they call them. And then the red and the blue are Iskander and hypersonic missiles that had been fired against Ukraine. You see where they were launched from and where they were headed to. That looks like a bowl of spaghetti almost. There are so many missiles flying there. First of all, I just kind of want your thoughts on what does this tell you about the Russian capacity for industrial capacity to be able to launch this many air attacks?
It's an overwhelming production capacity. And so I've said, and you and many other commentators who've been watching this conflict closely for the last 3 years, that Russia has been restraining itself in compared to a real war. This isn't a real war. If this was a real war, you would see Russia has the potential to go full scorched earth if necessary. They haven't done that from the beginning, but now you can see the conflict is entering a new phase. And what's going from a special military operation with very specific objectives like the demilitarization of Ukraine, the denazification, etc., and of course NATO membership is a big thing that they would like to prevent in Moscow. But now you're moving into what the officials in Moscow are alluding to as an anti-terror operation, and even as we speak, Ukraine is still launching attacks inside mainland Russia, hitting infrastructure, railway systems and so forth, hitting civilian targets as well. And then the potential targeted assassinations, the hitting of nuclear deterrence and so forth. All of these things add up to the reprioritization by Moscow. So you could say proverbially the gloves are off. But Russia has just an overwhelming capacity, especially with missiles, but also the ability to target Ukraine's air defenses. And that's what you're starting to see more of. And as the U.S. are having trouble supplying Ukraine, this has also given the Russian Federation the opportunity to target more of the air defenses, to the point where when Ukraine's air defenses are sufficiently hobbled, then Russia has not even entered the stage of this conflict where they're going to deploy their air force in a much bigger way for coordinated air operations. And if you saw how Russia performed in Syria in what is called Operation Aleppo, this was one of the most sophisticated, targeted, and efficient air operations on an area, it's the second largest city in Syria at the time, but completely neutralized the al-Nusra Front and the terrorist forces that were embedded in half of that city. And it was a brilliant operation. It was chronicled in Tim Ripley's excellent book, Operation Aleppo, former Times journalist, or I believe still a Times journalist, if I'm not mistaken. But so we haven't even reached that stage yet with Russia. But if things are heading in that direction, then I really don't see Ukraine having a chance of anything the longer this goes. And of course, Russia is absolutely in control of the pace of this conflict.
Let me ask you a question there. You mentioned the gloves coming off. We had Doug McGregor on early this week, and I kind of want your view on something that he said, because he always likes to look at the bigger picture and kind of zoom back and see how other things that are happening elsewhere in the world are also having an effect on there. And he argued that the difficulty that Russia is suddenly having with Azerbaijan and the war in the Middle East and the potential issue with Iran, and Russia may want to come to their control, concluded that the Russians, or put more emphasis for the Russians on, hey, we got to get this deal wrapped up. So instead of just going this slow, methodical thing, which could drag on another year, possibly longer, maybe we need to take the gloves off and go at a higher pace to get this off the table because we have too many other issues going on. What do you think of that?
Well, that's certainly, arguably, this is one of the reasons maybe why Russia couldn't mount any real defense of Syria back in December. Certainly, they needed the Syrian Arab Army to step up for that, but they were overextended in Ukraine. Had the Ukraine conflict not accelerated to where it took us in February of 2022, that situation in Syria might be very, very different. And these other issues, like being able to provide more support or at least positioning to help allies like Iran, that would also be a different story as well. So Russia they do have to mind the fact that they can be overextended. And this is exactly the strategy of the United States. And if you look at RAND Corporation documents and forward policy planning in Washington, that is exactly the strategy, is to overextend Russia. And that's seen as a winning gambit for the U.S. and its allies. So it's a very precarious time, especially if you add that the South Caucasus into the equation. And some people say that this is also a potential porous border as well, that certain things were smuggled into Russia via this area as well. So this is another hugely worrying thing. Not only that, but Russia's relationship with Turkey is very precarious. But they have to maintain good relations with Turkey. It's essential. So Russia is compromised and exposed in their southern positions. No doubt about that. This is a very, very sensitive, very, very delicate operation that Russia is having to carry out on multiple fronts.
And so does Russia, as far as you can tell, have the capacity to, take the gloves off is the term used, but to really ramp up? Meaning, is this something that we can expect to see more of? Can Russia maintain this 500 to 700 every other night drone strikes and missile strikes against Ukraine?
I think they're doing it clearly they're doing it in sort of pulses. And so that you have to also look at the timing of this, because Russia is now, I think, and this is the key and this is something Russia's done very well in different theaters. One of them was when they entered the conflict in Syria in October 2015, they immediately set the pace for that conflict. So everything the U.S. or their allies, the people who were trying to destabilize Syria, they had to basically follow what Russia was doing. So Russia learned that he who moves first then sets the pace of actions, and everyone else has to follow. So they do have this advantage in Ukraine now. And look what they've done politically. They've triggered Donald Trump just this week to do another flip-flop on his previous positions, which was this offensive by Russia did not go unnoticed, of course, in Washington. And now Trump is panicking because he's getting phone calls and panic calls from the Europeans and from the Ukrainians saying, we need more supplies, we need weapons, what are you going to do? They're pounding us. So, and that's a result of Russia setting the pace. And I think if you look at some of the strikes that didn't get a lot of press coverage on Nikolaev and on Odessa in the previous month. You can see that little by little, Russia's identifying positions, Ukrainian military entrenched positions, and other places where they're methodically taking out their opponent in key positions and overall weakening it. But Ukraine is still mobilizing, manpower, albeit through press gangs. But they claim that they can mobilize over 20,000 per month or something like this. I don't know where they're getting that number, but by the same token, Russia does have the ability to mobilize. So again, it's diminishing returns for Ukraine, and we see Russia's just really ramping up, building up their sort of defense and military, different branches of the military.
You mentioned a lot of the flip-flopping in the United States side. I want to zero in on that a little bit, because it's really kind of an embarrassing, I think is probably the most kind way I could put it, because Trump is in his 6th month, I guess. 3 times the U.S. has paused either ammunition or weapons flows to Ukraine, and then 3 times it has gone back. This most recent time just a day or so ago. So the question is, first of all, I mean, even before I get into some of the details here, what is the policy of the United States? What can you determine from the outside is America's policy? I mean, we either do or we don't give weapons, and then we go back and forth. What do you make of that?
I don't see any discernible policy. I do see, so short-term, tactical, I see no consistency at all. What I do see, though, with the U.S. is long-term, pretty much a continuation of the strategy. So beyond the rhetoric, beyond the talk, beyond the flip-flopping and Trump's tweets and, oh, I had a great phone call with Putin. Oh, I had a bad phone call with Putin. I like Putin, no, and I don't like him this week. Beyond all that, you see the continuity of strategy from the Biden administration on Ukraine and on the other flashpoints as well. But on Ukraine, there's no change. There's no material difference. So, and I think he's in a position now where he's managed to be seen to have strong-armed Europe into upping their spending commitments to 5% of GDP for NATO spending, and whether any of them are going to actually meet that in real terms is another discussion later. But so he's seen as kind of getting a win with Europe. But by the same token, the quid pro quo with the European leaders, and you can see they're kicking and screaming in Germany and other places about even the prospect of the U.S. reducing its commitment to supporting Ukraine. And of course, he needs to deliver there. If he wants Europe on side to help bear the burden of NATO, then he has to do something for Ukraine. And I think that's unfortunately for Trump, all of the pre-campaign, campaign, and early term rhetoric it's finished now. He has become shaped by events, shaped by institutions like NATO, and shaped by the U.S. Security state apparatus. The consensus in Washington has, I think, finally captured Trump. And I wasn't sure that would have been the case a couple of months ago, but it sort of looks like that's what's happening.
Yeah, I kind of get the feeling this way too, and others are starting to get the same feeling. And in fact, at a press briefing yesterday with Tammy Bruce at the State Department, one of the reporters asked this apparent contradiction between, what is the policy? Because you keep going back and forth. Here's what Tammy had to say.
I mentioned in our last briefing when there was some concern and hubbub about arms shipments stopping from the United States to Ukraine. And my warning then was, wait a minute, that this is one situation, that you should not extrapolate it as a new policy or position, that we have been and remain Ukraine's biggest supporters. We care about those people. We care about making sure that they have what they need.
Are we back to pre-July level, or is this administration now committed to deliver on all the previously made commitments?
The president has been very vocal about the wholesale slaughter that has been going on and how it has to stop, how there has to be a ceasefire, and how it has to be between the two parties.
Okay, the last part was the most. I had to watch it several times to go, wait, what did she just say? Because it's like she's just like seeing all these bumper stickers and just grabbing them out of her mind and then throwing them out of her mouth. Because wait, there has to be a ceasefire, but it has to be between the parties, and the war has to stop. And yet none of those things are happening, and there's no leverage to make any of them happen. What do you make of that?
No, there's a structural problem with the way the Trump administration's operating, both rhetorically and in their interfacing with other parties, namely the Russian Federation, is that they have this fundamental flaw in the negotiations, is that they believe, or they're talking about how they are somehow engaged in some sort of negotiations, or bringing the conflict to an end, or a ceasefire. And they're talking as if they're a neutral party, and they're still doing this. And then there's certain things that they won't admit publicly. They won't tell the public the truth about Ukrainian casualties on the battlefield, and then they over-exaggerate Russian casualties, and that frames the discussion of who's winning, who's not. So Ukraine's not losing, according to the U.S. They're still clinging to that, and but they're not a neutral party. They're not just an objective observer of events that wants to bring this wholesale slaughter, whatever Trump is characterizing it as, to an end. It's the U.S. is a co-belligerent. They're a co-belligerent, and so they're acting as if that the Ukraine has all of this agency, and this is exactly what the Biden administration was saying as well. This kind of it's a myth that Ukraine is a sovereign state with agency. All we're doing is just providing them things to defend themselves, but it's much more than that. And so, as long as the U.S. is going to cling to that, it's exactly what they're doing with Israel. By the way, exactly the same thing. That you're going to have a complete, constant breakdown of any and all meaningful negotiations. In other words, you will not move the ball down the field at all.
Well, let's look at that, because that's one of the frustrations of Trump, because he'll sometimes say, I've had this really good conversation with Putin. He's a nice guy. We have a good connection, etc. But then when Putin is very consistent and has never wavered on what he says he has to have, he's always said he's willing to talk. But then when it comes to what he's going to do on the battlefield, he's unmovable, which is either negotiate a settlement on our terms or the war continues on. Well, that didn't sit well with Trump, and now he says he's getting a little BS from Putin.
That was a war that should have never happened, and a lot of people are dying, and it should end. And I don't know, we get a lot of bullshit thrown at us by Putin for you want to know the truth. He's very nice all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless.
Is it really though? Because you call it BS, but what did Trump expect? Because Putin has never said, as far as we know in private, he's never said anything besides what he says in public.
No, Trump's just deflecting there. He's basically trying to project onto Putin what he himself is doing, which is totally inconsistent and totally spewing out what BS, as Trump was saying there. No, Russia's been totally consistent from day one. They're looking for post-Istanbul. They're looking for a political settlement. They're looking for a kind of more definitive settlement on their main points. They haven't changed at all. You can go look them up. It's totally consistent. The U.S. is all over the place, especially since Trump has become president. So I think this just unwillingness to accept the facts on the ground, and the unwillingness to go to Kiev and say, you're not getting the new regions back. You're not. They're gone. Crimea's gone. Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporozhye, gone. They're never coming back. So if the U.S. cannot deliver on those points, then it's almost like Trump is kind of giving Russia the green light, in a way, indirectly, to just move forward with their own national security objectives, which are very clear now, especially after the attacks by Ukraine inside Russia against its nuclear deterrent, especially, but other in Kursk as well. So in a way, it's almost like Trump and Putin, if you want to be conspiratorial about it, or unbeknownst to Trump, he's actually giving Russia the green light.
And let's look a little bit further at that in terms of Trump, because I think it's unwittingly as opposed to conspiratorially, because he's not taken a lot of the criticism very well. And I think it was in that same cabinet meeting presser there. I think it was the CNN reporter, if I'm not mistaken, asked him basically this whole issue about the pausing and then unpausing this help to Ukraine. Whose responsibility was that? Watch how this goes.
Last week, the Pentagon paused some shipments of weapons to Ukraine. Did you approve of that pause?
We wanted to put defensive weapons because Putin is he's not treating human beings right. He's killing too many people. So we're sending some defensive weapons to Ukraine, and I've approved that.
So who ordered the pause last week?
I don't know. Why don't you tell me?
I think that's a question for the Pentagon.
Go ahead.
Mr.
Yeah.
President, on immigration.
So yeah, he's just not going to answer that, because either the answer was Hegseth did it on his own and didn't talk to me, or I did it and then I undid it. Either way, it's not going to look good. So, but that, to me, that was just a really bizarre response. Who do you tell me?
Yeah,
job?
and by the way, I'm loath to say this, but Caitlin Collins from CNN has been asking very good questions, doing actual journalism, which to me for CNN is shocking. But anyway, we'll put that aside. So he's not letting go of this trope. Putin's killing too many people. Russia is meticulous about civilian casualties. So we're talking about combatants here. But Trump is characterizing it as if it's the population. So it's very clear, where the deaths and the casualties are on both sides of this. And so he is still kind of playing that narrative. But the other one that was really disturbing was, and I don't know if you have a clip of this or not, Danny, but the statement of John Ratcliffe, the CIA director, alluding to Russia using chemical weapons, or alluding to having
I hadn't even seen that.
Yeah, this is just in the last 24 hours, I think. But it's a little bit disturbing that they would want to pull the chemical weapons card. I mean, that is the last card of desperation, if indeed they're planning to pull that card with Russia. I mean, in terms of trying to win the public narrative of, a just war, that's clearly what that's designed
That sounds
to
like
do.
either 2003 or many times against Syria. We always pull that out to justify things. So that's curious. We'll
when
see
in
where that
fact
one
there's
is going.
evidence of Ukraine using chemical weapons, and that's very well documented, and also or trying to use chemical weapons on the battlefield, and that's also been very well documented, at least on the Russian side.
Danny, we happen to have that clip right now if you'd like to play it.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Mr. President, the Ukrainians have asked the international court to go after Russia for using toxic chemicals in the site. Germany and Germany and the Netherlands have had intelligence saying that. What does U.S. intelligence believe, and what do you believe about the use of chemical weapons? And would you agree that that's a case for the court?
Well, ask John maybe to discuss it if you'd like, John.
Well, Mr. President, obviously, chemical weapons, if it's documented and its use, it's illegal. It's against all international laws of armed conflict and treaties. And obviously, I can't share in this room with this audience the intelligence that I can share with you privately. But obviously, you're not going to stand or allow for any violations of international law by anyone.
That's right. Thank you.
Oh man, do I need to say what?
Go ahead, say it, Danny.
Wow. So I guess a lot of things in Israel are just about to come to a halt if we're not going to allow any international violations of. Yikes!
Of
Danny,
international.
and the other thing that happened, I don't know if you could hear, you could barely hear, but Trump leans over to Hegseth saying, "Do you know anything about this?"
Is that what he? I was going to say the body language looked like that's what he said, but I couldn't hear. Is that what he actually said?
Yes. Do you know anything about this?
Oh my God! I'm sorry. Replay that if you would.
Yeah, it'll take me a minute to loop it up again. Give me a second. Yeah.
It's extraordinary. So they're passing the buck between them. You can see trying to do this on the fly, and and it's always with this show of force. I've got my AG there, I've got my defense secretary, I've got my secretary of state there. They're all there to kind of buttress Trump. I don't remember always having these conversations with full paneled cabinet, you know, in the past administrations, Daniel, there was always some compartmentalization in terms of dealing with foreign policy, domestic policy. But with Trump, he likes this kind of The Apprentice kind of look, you know, of having everybody, everyone impaneled there, you know, and then discussions are done on the fly by committee, as we just saw. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah. All right, let's listen real carefully here.
Go after Russia for using toxic chemicals in the site. Germany and Dutch Germany and the Netherlands have had intelligence saying that. What does U.S. intelligence believe, and what do you believe about the use of chemical weapons? And would you agree that that's the case from the court?
Well, that's John maybe to discuss that. If
Oh,
you like, John.
okay. It's like egg to the wind. What is he talking about?
Obviously, chemical weapons, if
Oh,
it's
heck.
documented and its use, it's illegal. It's against all international.
Anyway, yeah, that's a good enough. Let's
laws
just
of
come back
armed
out of there.
conflict and
He'll just
treaties
repeat that same
and-
thing there. But that has so many Syrian vibes and then so many desert weapons of mass destruction vibes from 2003. That can't be any good. But we'll keep monitoring that. We'll see if anything comes from it. One thing I want to talk about before we go too much further in there is this. Okay, Trump has unpaused this, right? So now he's turned back on whatever had been turned off. You know, like I said, for the third time. This comes, you know, as Russia launches the largest ever air strike in a single 24-hour period, et cetera. And so it's like, okay, Gary, I don't think Gary has it up right now because I didn't ask for it, but there was a meeting or a headline in, I think it was the NBC News that said it was the New York Times, and it maybe even been today, where they said, you know, the Ukraine is hopeful but cautious about the fact that this is turned back on. They're glad. Well, then it turns out, I think from Axios this morning, that when you look at what's actually in the package here, you see that there's, Gary, if you can toss that headline up, the one from Axios, that there's a whopping, I think there's 10 interceptors in the initial package that's being sent out there. So I don't know what else is included in that, but yikes, that's not very many we're talking about here. So even if it was, let's say 100, what is 100 more air interceptors going to do when you have this kind of barrage on an every other night basis?
That's 15 minutes worth of air cover for maybe some small corner of Kiev or something. I mean, it's pretty obvious what's happened here, Danny, is that Israel has depleted a lot of these stocks because of, and that's an unprovoked war of aggression by Israel against Iran, which started a chain of events that lasted 12 days, which has, and our stocks are going to be prioritized for Israel, no doubt about that. And most people aren't aware that the entire Iron Dome, it's not a system called the Iron Dome. It is an array of anti-missile and anti-aircraft batteries that is put together in interoperable that has some different systems in it, but these are all pretty much United States systems that are supplied by the U.S. The U.S. does the technical support that used to be run out of Stuttgart, Germany, which was an array of first generation, second generation Patriot missiles, which has now been developed into more of an integrated system to hit different missile targets. But it's a U.S. system. The whole of it is a U.S. system. And we even have people on the ground, you know, who are responsible for maintaining and also for training and all sorts of things like this. So it's the number one priority. Ukraine is second. It's a distant second if Israel is under threat. It's a distant second. Yeah. And I think Russia senses this, but and that's why they're putting the pressure on right now with Ukraine. It's a smart thing to do from a military point of view, and you're taking advantage of the fact that the U.S. is overextended right now.
Yeah, and we're going to just keep on overextending. But apparently the Germans, or as you saw in that Axios piece there, they said, hey, y'all should give them some more Patriots. In fact, maybe we'll give some too. And in fact, the German Chancellor Merz, the new Chancellor of Germany, seems to be intent on trying to say, oh, yeah, well, whatever France and Britain can do, we can do even better. It's like he's wanting to try and bow up a little bit, which is not playing well in some of the German public. In fact, one of the German parliamentarians, Alternative für Deutschland, took the chancellor to task.
New rules and regulations are constantly being added. Why didn't the government actually start with this before launching the debt torpedo? Instead, Friedrich Merz travels through world history and devotes himself to the favorite project of all other parties, giving away billions of euros in tax money abroad and to the EU. The icing on the cake is that the Chancellor wants to use the new megadebt to buy weapons worth $42.3 billion for Ukraine, while the promised tax cut for citizens in this country will not come after all. This is an absolute impertinence towards the working middle classes in this country. It is an indictment that you have broken your word again here. What's more, it is a fatal signal that the seriousness of the situation in Germany and the signs of the times have still not been recognized.
What do you think about that situation in Germany there? First of all, they're talking about Germany's going into debt to get a lot of the stuff in Germany. It used to be the most fiscally responsible government in Europe, but now then they seem to be following our lead and saying, hey, let's just throw a bunch of debt into this. What do you understand about this situation?
Well, all the EU countries are in a slightly different predicament budget-wise because they have legislation safeguards in place for deficit spending, and so their first round of their budget effectively is approved by Brussels, and they have to maintain a certain fiscal position for the stability of the union, for the stability of the ECB, and so if they want to go above and beyond that, they'll need to raise their debt ceilings, and that. In some cases requires a constitutional amendment or some kind of a change to what are those are immovable policies in Europe. Europe doesn't do U.S. style deficit spending, so they're very conscious. There's already a debt to GDP ratio issue with a lot of European countries, so that's how they're going to finance this rearming of Europe. And so this was a big set piece of Friedrich Merz when he was coming into power, and it seemed like they had the kind of basics of this ready to go, but it's a lot more complicated than that. So what they're asking, and what they're asking their people is, we're going to impose austerity measures in order to pay for defense, basically, and the 5% NATO GDP commitment that absolutely requires either austerity, IMF-style cutting of social programs or other things, or entitlements and things like that, unfunded liabilities, and then instead of basically doing what they did before, which was practice fiscal responsibility. So they were having the U.S. provide the bulk of NATO power in Europe. That worked really well. This transition is going to be very hard and painful. They're having trouble selling it. So Merz, it kind of wrote in on this agenda at the beginning, but now you can see German parliament, you see the opposition popping up. And they even had questions today about the illegality of the U.S. Israeli strikes on Iran in German parliament this week. So the opposition is there because I think for Germans, you're going to, it was a popular position to support Ukraine before, but when it comes to the crunch financially and what that's going to mean for Germany, Germany has to be fiscally responsible. If they're not, then they are basically the engine, the economic engine that drives Europe. And if there's a crisis in the South, they've proven that they, through their financial might, can bail out the Southern European states as they did after the financial crisis of 2008. Right. So if you take that away from Germany, that's already suffering from having to pay over the odds for U.S. imported LNG because of the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline and sanctions, not being allowed to buy fuel from Russia, oil and gas, it makes things even more difficult. German industry is offshoring. Their expertise, their engineers, they're suffering a bit of a upper management brain drain as well in that country as a result of the flight of German industry because of economic pressures. So I think it's taken time for the penny to drop in Germany, but you're going to see more opposition. The question is, how's that going to be dealt with internally, and how's the press going to be managing that narrative? Because clearly the press is very pro-U.S. Ultimately, but could the pressure be such in Europe that the sums just don't add up, and they're also facing political challenges from, they just had a near miss with the AfD. And that issue's not going away. That party is going to increase probably in popularity as a result of these types of policies.
Well, yeah, and especially if the economic pain on the Germans themselves continues to escalate, and as a result of funneling off all this money to Ukraine, that's only going to make the AfD more popular, I would think.
Yeah, not only that, they've gone off the whole Ukrainian refugee virtue signaling. That's past its sell-by date in Poland as well as in Germany. So the longer this drags on, it's just begging for some kind of an end state. And the end state for Merz and for the Eurohawks and for Mark Rutte, the new Secretary General of NATO, is obviously selling a war, selling a military buildup in Europe. But, you know, leadership can certainly do that. And when they're on those big platforms with Macron, Trump, Merz, and Starmer, and some other European leaders and Rutte, it might seem like the right thing to do to show solidarity and to provide a united front against the Russian aggressor. But when you go back to your own countries and you have to deal with your own internal political situation, and you know your sums have to add up in terms of budget and delivery of services to the public, it's a different conversation altogether. So I think it's just going to become increasingly more unpopular as it becomes known that Ukraine cannot win. So it's always to prevent Russia from winning. That psychologically, this is the big hang up for the Europeans. Russia can't be seen to win, but there must be a way. The U.S. could provide this, which is a way to make it seem like Russia didn't win, but Ukraine didn't lose, and somehow negotiate something in the middle. And I think Europe can live with that, but maybe the Ukrainians, the current regime, can't. But the other option is basically more of the same, which I just see the whole thing getting worse for Europe and Ukraine.
You know, it sounds like one of those, look, all I want to do is eat chicken and pizza and McDonald's and lose about 20 pounds. That's all I'm asking for. And so I'm going to keep spinning that. Okay, well, you can say it all day long. It's not going to make any difference when you get on the scales, but so we'll keep watching on that. But somebody else that not just the German public that's paying attention to this, it's also Russia.
If the federal chancellor wishes to call and have a conversation, I have said this many times, we do not refuse any contacts and are always open to them. Can Germany contribute more than the United States as a mediator in our negotiations with Ukraine? I doubt it. A mediator must be neutral. And when we see German Leopard tanks on the battlefield, and now we are talking and observing that the Federal Republic is considering supplying Taurus missiles for attacks on Russian territory, not only the equipment itself, but with the involvement of Bundeswehr officers, of course, serious questions arise. Everyone knows very well that if this happens, it will not affect the course of hostilities. That is out of the question, but it will completely ruin our relations.
A couple of things I want to zero in on there and get your view on is that Putin made a point of saying there are German tanks in this fight against our troops here. And how are we going to have good relationships then if even the possibility of a mediator, which you spoke about earlier, about not being neutral. But why do you suppose that Putin brought up the issue of German tanks?
I think they're symbolic. It's a big set piece, and certainly it gets a lot of press coverage in Germany as part of their commitment. So you remember it was the Leopards, and so it's one of those big set military pieces. So I think they're very symbolic as well. Also, you have to consider the historical implications of Russia and Germany in past conflicts. So from a Russian point of view, it's not a good look if you want to negotiate or be involved in some kind of negotiated settlement. So that's the only thing I can see. I mean, I don't think the Leopards are very consequential anymore on the battlefield as the conflict is moving so rapidly towards drone warfare. So maybe the tanks aren't playing as big of a role. They might be in terms of, for Russia, in terms of keeping the peace in territory which they will eventually conquer. But from the German and Ukrainian side, I don't see much tactically from those sort of things. But there are really great political kind of shiny objects for European politicians. Say, oh look, we've just sent another 30 Leopard tanks, as if that's going to make any significant difference on the battlefield.
And do you think Putin's right also when he says, hey, even if they use the Taurus and more Patriot interceptors, that's not going to change the outcome? So do you think it's accurate that whether Germany gives Taurus and Patriots or they give none of either, will it change the outcome?
Yeah, I mean, Putin's already drawn the red line on the missiles from Germany. So it's, if they're going to go through with that, and then if Ukraine is then using those, hitting targets in Russian territory, I can't see personally that they would actually do that. He's said he's going to do it. It's the right thing to say politically, I guess, at this time in Germany, and to show Donald Trump and the Americans that and the British that Germany is committed and they mean business. But in reality, that of course would be a disaster. That would be just a disaster. Either Ukraine would just get pounded in ways that we haven't seen before, or you're risking a situation where the Russians have said quite clear that we reserve the right to strike the source of those armaments, and be it a target inside Germany. Then we're into a whole new reality there. Germany definitely doesn't want to go down that road, but they're still making the threats. I think Russia's already priced this in. They priced it in, but Putin listen, you can't, Russia is a very fickle political environment for a leader to hold power even for a few years, let alone 25. So you're looking at a very skilled politician, and Putin's very skillfully using the German statements to maximum advantage domestically and internationally. Very skillful. And so he's not going to pass up any opportunity to make a meal out of some of the crazy things that they're saying in Europe right now.
And one of the perverse, I guess, consequences of all this talk of support, whether it's from Merz, Starmer, Macron, or now Trump jumping in and saying, yeah, we're going to restart all our process here, is it gives the Ukraine side fodder to say, no, we just need to hang on a little longer because more stuff is coming. And then some magical day in the future, things can change, I guess. But we just got to stay in the fight. And in fact, you had former Ukrainian Minister of Defense Reznikov came out and said that, listen, this is actually what he said. Putin is afraid of Ukraine because we are a threat to his regime. Not sure how he gets there, but that's what he said. If the Russian population sees a democratic, liberal European path is better than tyranny, then for the regime, it will become a matter of survival. That is why I believe only after a change of leadership in Russia will we have a real chance to live in normal, peaceful coexistence with the Russians, Reznikov said. So, and the implication being the war is just going to continue on indefinitely. And they think that they can continue to do it before. I mean, it's just complete verbal nonsense, all this, that the Russians are sitting there pining away and wishing that they could be a Ukrainian or something like that. So that's just actually bizarre, not even absurd. But the point being, though, that I think is not absurd is that the Ukraine side believes, and this was actually also in the New York Times, I think this morning, that they're optimistic and hopeful because of all of these things here. But what does that do to the likely outcome of this, them continuing on to fight?
It's the same narrative we've seen pretty much for the last couple of years, that the wonder weapons are on the way. First it was the F-16s, then it was the HIMARS, then it was the
ATACMS,
the ATACMS, the Abrams tanks, and we just need a few more F-16s, and then the Storm Shadow missiles as well. That's going to be the thing that's going to break the Russians back. We've got them on their back heels and so forth. You know what it looks like here And it's already well documented that the first phase of this conflict was basically a giant metal recycling operation to empty Europe of all of its former Soviet gear, especially the Eastern Bloc NATO countries, donate them to Ukraine, then turn them into scrap metal, and then backfill with new and updated material and equipment. So it seems like there's an economic component in the West, an economic incentive. And look, we only need to look at the stock market in Europe and look at how well performing the European defense stocks are. It's unbelievable. So there's so much money, especially the Italian companies, and you have companies like Leonardo and many others, and British companies as well as German and European countries. So there's a very cynical and quite nefarious economic incentive that's going on at that elite level. And if you look at, just look at the Bilderberg conference, which was in Stockholm, Sweden at the beginning of June, and it was all about defense, AI with military applications, drone warfare, swarming, and all these other new things that they see this as a new industry. And these captains of industry are very well positioned to profit on it if this Ukraine war theater carries on, you see. And so I hate to say it, but that's really, I think, driving a large portion of policy and rhetoric and attitudes at the elite bureaucratic European level and the U.S. level as well.
Yeah, and of course that is so egregious to me, and I'm sure you too, because the bill payers are the Ukrainian people, the ones who are hapless and have no power in this, the ones you talk about being press ganged into service. They're just, I mean, almost sacrificial pawns. Maybe not even a pawn, because sometimes a pawn can take something else. This is more like just throwing twigs into a fire to keep your financial engine going. I think it's immoral and just egregious to the highest degree, but we have what we have. Before I let you go today, I want to shift gears real quick to the Middle East. I'm going to stick in with Europe, though, to get there, because I often have, in fact, I just did say something, about Macron and how he wants to keep the Russia-Ukraine war going all the time and just seems disconnected from reality, at least verbally, on the Israeli situation, especially with Hamas. He made an address before the British Parliament to where he actually said something that I agreed with.
And I believe in the future of the two-state solution as a basis for regional security architecture, which will enable Israel to live in peace and security alongside its neighbors. But I want to be clear. Calling today for a ceasefire in Gaza without any condition is just telling to the rest of the world that for us as Europeans, there is no double standard. And as we are attached to human lives, as we are attached to territorial integrity, we want a ceasefire. No discussion. And today, working together in order to recognize the state of Palestine and to initiate this political momentum is the only path to peace.
A lot of applause there, and certainly I agree with that. An immediate ceasefire in Gaza and then recognition of a Palestinian state, that would be great. But Patrick, where are any actions behind his words?
That's the problem, Daniel. It's a great speech, but that was the position of European countries, including the UK, before October 7th, that they were committed to working towards a Palestinian state. Previous UK governments, as well as European governments. So Macron's come, I think, politically and made that grand speech and will get some support for it. But then he could turn around. He did this just a couple of months ago, did a quick U-turn backing Netanyahu, inviting, some of these people like Jolani for state visits in Paris, former, founder of Al-Qaeda in Syria. So it's hard to get a read on what Macron's doing. I think he is also in a very precarious position domestically, politically, hugely unpopular, and there's a big Palestinian support base in France as well, and you're starting to see in Spain, it's having a major effect on government policy right now, and that's going to happen throughout Europe. So I think Macron very cleverly and cynically is positioning himself a little bit to look like he's on the right side of this issue, because it seems like the wind in Europe is blowing in that direction right now. But as I said, Daniel, that was the policy of all these countries for a long time, but they abandoned that after October 7th and were all in for Israel and allowed Israel to get to the point it is now, which is a dire situation. And the question is, what will Macron announce sanctions against Israel? So he's playing that same type of conversation where, oh, we're just a disinterested observer here. We'd like to see peace. We'd like to see a ceasefire, but he's providing material support and political cover for Israel, who, according to Europe's own institutions like the International Court of Justice and the ICC, of which France is a signatory to, are guilty or at least indicted for war crimes and what is considered a plausible case for genocide, where they censured Israel to have a prohibition on the types of things they're doing, like laying siege to Gaza, targeting civilians, and so forth. And they're all in violation of the international arms control international treaties. You can't supply any weapons or anything to anybody that's suspected of being involved in human rights abuses or targeting civilians with military. And yet they're all still supporting Israel. So I want to see those announcements like, no, that's it, sanctions, embargo. Then we know they're serious. As yet, don't see it.
So what is, as far as you understand, in Europe at large, is there even the possibility that populations would support any of their leaders doing exactly what you suggest and putting some teeth behind the words finally, and saying, no, there's going to be an economic cost to Europe, Israel, because obviously the counterbalance to that is the pro-Israeli supporters all throughout the Western world that are putting a lot of money and pressure on any politician to do anything besides maybe allow them like this to have a word, but when it comes to actions, they will viciously oppose them. Is there any chance of that happening now?
In some countries, there is. There's, I think, in Spain, absolutely. In Spain, so Spain, the anti-war movement sentiment is growing in Spain as such that there are people mobilizing now to protest against Spain pursuing a 5% spend for NATO commitment. And so Trump has reciprocated with threats of tariffs on Spain if they don't spend the money. I mean, total attack on their sovereignty. But Greece as well, you're starting to see an anti-Israeli kind of uprising a little bit on that in terms of public opinion in Greece and some other countries as well. Italy, absolutely. So there's a big difference between Southern and Northern Europe on the mobilizing on that issue. And I think historically that's the case, especially former, countries with a real socialist and, trade unionist pedigree into the late 20th century. There's still passionate issues for the left in those countries. So that can't be ignored. In Northern Europe, it's different. It's different. I think they've been compromised and maybe more propagandized. And I think maybe a change of leadership in Brussels might somehow shift some of that a little bit. But the level of Israel penetration in Northern Europe in terms of the lobby and its alignment with right-wing political parties, or getting AfD on side with Israel, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and in the UK, Keir Starmer as a Labour leader. You've never seen a Labour leader in history kowtowing to Israel in the way that this government has. It's just was unheard of before. I mean, even with Tony Blair, the two-state solution was kind of a red line, But with Starmer, it's basically Israel gets what it wants with no conditions whatsoever. And that's been the position, especially since October 7th, or since he's come into office. And the results have been just spectacularly horrific as a result. So I don't know. Yeah. There is definitely a north-south divide on that issue with Europe.
Well, we'll see where it goes. And, at some point, just humanity might seem to seep in a little bit to some policy, but I don't know, maybe I'm just wishful thinking there. But anyway, we'll continue to wait and see how this thing goes, and we'll certainly keep tracking it as events happen, and we'll see if teeth ever pop out of the mouths of these guys who make these otherwise good statements. Thanks so much for coming on today, Patrick. Always a pleasure to have you on there, and also just sending people to your site there. And anything new you want to highlight here today from your Substack?
Well, I just launched the Substack, so we're just populating it with some articles, more personal content about me and my work, and different type of content that they'll see on 21stcenturywire.com, which is really just a lot of deep analysis and research. On Substack, I'm doing more personal journalism, so slightly different project for me, and it's going okay so far. So we're happy with how it's progressing.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, certainly recommend people go and check that out. So thanks for coming on today, and we'll look forward to seeing you all on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.